For the ancient Egyptians, the death of a pharaoh marked the beginning of a sacred journey. Preparing the royal body for the afterlife was a carefully organized process. After the pharaoh's death, the royal body was taken to a special place, where skilled embalmers began the long process of preservation. The first stage was purification. The body was carefully washed and cleansed before the embalmers began the preservation process. According to ancient Egyptian mummification practices, the brain was removed through the nose using specialized tools. The procedure was performed carefully by trained embalmers. Most internal organs were removed. Through a small incision in the abdomen, they were preserved in canopic jars. Then, the body was dried with natron. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were preserved separate the body because Egyptians considered it essential person's eye judgment in the laflied. Once the internal organs had been prepared, the body entered the longest stage of the process, drying it with natron, a naturally occurring mixture of salts. After drying, the embalmers removed the natron, cleansed the body, and applied fragrant oils and resins to protect the skin. The dried body was carefully restored, using linen and natural materials to return it to a more lifelike shape. The final protection began with layers of linen. Protective amulets were placed between the wrappings to guard the deceased. Each arm and leg was wrapped separately, with linen secured by resin, while protective amulets were placed between the layers. Next, the torso was wrapped layer by layer, with resin helping the linen adhere and protect the preserved body. Amulets were placed between the linen layers, each carrying a protective meaning for the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Finally, the head and neck were carefully wrapped, completing the protective layers around the pharaoh's preserved body. After many layers of linen, the entire body was completely enclosed, forming a protective covering around the preserved mummy. A ceremonial mask was placed over the wrapped head. It represented the pharaoh's identity and prepared him for the next stage of the funeral. The wrapped mummy was placed inside a decorated coffin. Additional layers of protection were prepared for the pharaoh's burial. While the mummy rested inside its coffins, priests prepared the objects and offerings believed to protect and sustain the pharaoh in the afterlife. When the preparations were complete, the pharaoh's funeral procession began, carrying the royal coffin toward the Nile and the final burial rites. The procession crossed the Nile toward the western bank, where the ancient Egyptians believed the realm of the dead began. After reaching the western bank, the procession continued toward the royal tomb, carrying the pharaoh toward his final resting place. At last, the procession reached the entrance of the royal tomb, where the final rituals would prepare the pharaoh for the afterlife. Before the burial, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, symbolically restoring the pharaoh's ability to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. The coffin was carried into the burial chamber and carefully placed inside the massive stone sarcophagus, prepared for the pharaoh's eternal rest. Inside the burial chamber, offerings and sacred objects surrounded the sarcophagus, prepared to accompany and protect the pharaoh in the afterlife. Once the final rituals were complete, the burial chamber was sealed, protecting the pharaoh and his funerary treasures for eternity. The final seal was placed on the tomb, closing the pharaoh's burial chamber and marking the end of the ancient funeral ceremony. With the tomb sealed, the rituals were complete. According to Egyptian belief, the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife could now begin. Egyptians believed the heart would be judged against the feather of Maat, measuring whether the deceased had lived according to truth and justice. If the heart passed the judgment, the deceased could enter the blessed afterlife and continue an eternal existence.
After the burial, the tomb fell silent beneath the desert cliffs, while the pharaoh's name and memory were meant to survive for eternity.
Thousands of years later, the tomb, the inscriptions, and the mummy still reveal how ancient Egyptians understood death, preservation, and eternal life.
Natron, linen, oils, resins, and protective amulets were among the essential materials used to preserve and prepare the body.
For the ancient Egyptians, mummification was more than preservation. It was a sacred preparation for eternal life in the afterlife. From purification to burial, every stage of mummification was carefully performed to protect the pharaoh's body and prepare him for eternal life.
The journey from death to burial was complete. For the ancient Egyptians, preserving the body meant preserving the hope of eternal life.